Hello, everyone. My name is Ali Asad. I am a doctoral researcher operating within the Curatorial Research Collective. Welcome to the sixth talk in our Open for Discussion series, which attempts to critically engage with what we recognize is a persistent problem architecture has with diversity and representation. Over the past several weeks, and with a diverse group of guest speakers, my colleagues have explored how such problems have manifested and, in certain cases, how they can be mitigated against within the context of architectural education and within the architecture profession. Today, we will be exploring the diversity of gender and sexuality within our third thematic realm, that of the built environment. It is not necessarily a meditation on the city or what is urban, but more so on how we use the world around us, how we appropriate it, and subsequently the agency we could have to leave our mark. American scholar Amy Stanley suggests that through micro-histories, gender history and theory and queer theory, we could try to recover narratives within global history that have cut off the more democratic, the more inclusive, and the less boring of our histories. But then how do we position those micro visions of our past and our present within visions for more inclusive future worlds? To help us maybe answer that question and to raise many, many more, please help me welcome our two brilliant speakers, Roberto Perez Gayo and Lucas Larochel. Welcome, Roberto, welcome, Lucas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So please feel free to forward any questions you may have to either of our speakers in the Q&A box, and we will hope to answer those a little bit later. We'll start off with Roberto. Roberto is a social designer, a researcher, and a pedagogue based here in the Netherlands. Their multifaceted practice incorporates making, performance, writing, and activism, both individually and in collaboration. Their focus is centered in queerness, digital culture, geopolitical design, performative methodologies, public space, and social justice. A Glitch in the System, Deconstructing JC Deco, Decoding Suit Supply, a co-written work, has recently been published in the 2021 Routledge publication, Contentious Cities, Design and the Gendered Production of Space, which is available to read in part on Google Books. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm gonna see if I can try to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, fantastic.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting. And yeah, today I would like to share actually some of the parts of the chapter in the book that you're referencing, and also like linking them with other research projects and also performative projects that I've been doing, as a way of like having a bit of a look at the way in which actually is like urban development has been happening in the Netherlands, but also like as a way of like trying to emphasize a tiny bit what is like the assemblage and then the related media technologies, databases, quantitative methodologies and discourses, which are completely linked to the monitoring of measuring and capitalization of bodies in public space, and actually as well the production and reproduction of identity in public space. So I will, some of this work I've been co-developing, as you were mentioning, also with social designer Gabriel and Meyer. So I would like also like to give a heads up also to the collaboration and the work with that. And I will start a bit with showing this image, which is actually one of the campaigns, because also one of the things that I would like to show is a bit of the methodology of work, because actually one of the ways that we were like trying to put forward is actually how to work from the minimal unit or minimal element, and then from there being really able to pull the threads and being able to look at like much more of like macro structures and all of the interrelated infrastructures that actually are at play. And then this poster that you see in here is a campaign of Suit Supply that was like put forward in 2008. There were like around something like 6,000 posters distributed all over the Netherlands, featuring a series of staged, intimately homoerotic images for the Dutch fashion brand Suit Supply. What was interesting is like many of these posters and actually billboards were vandalized. There were like public demonstrations, there were like counter protests all across the country, and plenty of online and offline debates that were like triggered regarding the physical and the representational behaviors that they are also like defections that they are deemed acceptable to perform in public. All of these was actually distributed by the multinational GCTECO, which is the largest outdoor advertising company in the world. And with this, I would like to bring it forward as a way of like almost like a methodology of work to render visible this assemblage of media technologies in the Netherlands. One of the things that I would like to address is that although in the Netherlands, normally there's a bit of a common understanding that it is one of the most liberal countries in terms of sexual politics, the Dutch still continue to feel quite uneasy when it comes to day-to-day concerns of sexuality, especially in public space. Several studies by the Netherlands Institute of Social Research or any other agencies are evidencing how everyday spaces in the Netherlands are still often experienced by LGBTQ individuals as aggressively heterosexual, and supports like a view quite superficial towards acceptance of non-normative sexual and gender orientation, a real tension and a contradiction in this production of the self-image of the Netherlands. There is a bit of like this line in here that actually is put forward, this rhetoric that it's all fine and well for you to be different as long as I don't say it. And then this becomes almost a question of visibility versus ideology that is placing public intimacy at the front. And then within this context, the disruptive power of supply's image is exposing the heteronormativity of public space and is stressing how gender and sexual identities are constrained as actually heterosexuality has been neutralized and inscribed in basically these structures. The branding message of actually Fokke de Jong and Supply is quite controversial in the best of cases and actually relies on representations of gender, sexuality, and race that amplify a particular type of masculinity and consumer appeal. The disruptive quality of these images depends a lot on recontextualization of attitudes and behaviors that mimic or glorify gender representations of the past, almost with wannabe ironic way that centers the objectification and subordination of female subjects. Also, there is questions of racialized power dynamics also, and obvious cultural appropriations and colonialist references. In Your Perfect Fit, in the campaign, in the image I was showing, we see exactly the same recognizable form that is featured in other campaigns. However, in here, we see different subjects of gender and sexual representation. Although this campaign, actually in the Netherlands, by some collectives, it was perceived to be in support for LGBTQ identities. In fact, like the position that we are taking at NBD in our work is actually non-normative gender and sexual representations are used by suppliers to reach potential new consumer groups. And in this way, target marketing gay masculinities in this instance is actually aligning to developing public space new forms of standardization, not only because they are activating the same sexual representations, but also through processes of homonormalization through which certain gay normativities actually are privileged. Maybe it's good also to say as a way of another layer, because this is almost like a series of like interconnected elements in here that everything is contributing. GCTECO is like the #1 outdoor advertising company worldwide and has like also a capacity to be really able to describe in public space these processes of normatization. Operating through a model in which actually they provide street furniture to municipalities in return for the control of the integrated panels. GCTECO has also become a bit like part of a paradigm of city transformation through processes of commercialization of public space. And also like GCTECO calculates a bit like the demand of corporate advertising into account for transit service, becoming an integrating force in the development of urban areas. And also in many cases, part of decision-making processes, which determine also like the level of service in neighborhoods and also like around the globe. This also we find it interesting because it's almost an example, of the so-called media architecture complex, which is a bit of a broader increasing convergence of media with urban space transforming the shape of the cities. The bus stop becomes a really interesting space because as an infrastructure, this is also designed as a standardized and homogeneous architectural space, which is evenly distributed in the global metropolitan landscape, and also becomes a node with an informational and transportational network in which gender and sexual representations are put forward by advertising media, and they are embedded with the capacity to punctuate and orient behavior. actually, this happens in quite several levels, like because on one hand, actually these images are repeated, relying on exposure, depending on passing bys and commuters, but also bodies are also repeatedly directed and organized in this space through different affordances or denials of specific vocabularies of movement and orientation. To distribute these images, GCDecode is relying on geomarketing software packages, specifically one that is called CAFAS, that was developed in 2011 by a joint action, which actually GCDecode was part, but not only. And the goal was to develop like a new measuring system through which to manage all outdoor media in the Netherlands and their targeted audiences. And to accomplish this, they conducted quite a huge actually research in which they were like doing an environmental classification. They were like provided situational and visibility measures, travel servers, and all of this structure on socio-demographic mobility databases. This software, which is really interesting, is allowing strategic decisions and points for media placement in relationship to target consumer identities. So as a result, this geomarketing infrastructure contributes to the construction and management of gender and sexual identity in public space through a double process. On a way, there is a bit of like identity becomes a bit of a result of categorization processes based on monitoring and segmentation of population. And on the other, identity is constructed through access and exposure to information. Because as being targeted also like relies on a certain idea of like, it is not only like you are where you live, but through this commercialization, you are what you buy. What else? Yeah. As I was mentioning, in this big bubble that we had with this campaign around, there were like also a lot of like political campaigns that were like happening around this. In recent years, aggressions against non-heterosexual representation and behaviors in public space has been activated by all political parties and politicians alike, and evidence that certain freedoms are actually being taken away from the Dutch social value system. And following demonstrations like such hand in hand that you can see in here on the left, also other counter campaigns, actually, we can see how they are like trying to target specifically profile groups. So these political campaigns are not only activating quite a lot homo-nationalistic framework by which actually they are prefacing certain identities in detriment of another ones, but also they are contributing to homonormative process by promoting and privileging specific representations that fits into nationalistic ideological framework. For example, if you look at the campaign here of the VVD, the Sud Supply campaign, the image has been completely removed and has been actually what has been put forward is a generic stock photograph of two men kissing with a much more idealized romantic that desexualized it completely, which reflects a preference towards much more standardized lifestyles and profiles of sexual orientation under the guise of mononormativity. Under the guise, alongside these other like institutionalized, there was like another big, enormous series of demonstrations, public demonstrations, both online and offline, that stood equally outspoken. Like for example, this one is called Iedereen mag zoenen, it's like everybody may kiss. At various locations in public space, like protesters, they were like gathering and they were like set out to physically reenact the central gesture of the kiss of the Sud Supply campaign that afforded a bit of like the impact to the whole campaign. The reenactment in a way becomes almost like a representational feedback loop between the physical and the online space, transforming Sud Supply's images in a blueprint for self-portraits that contributes to the role that media can have in normalizing processes. However, what is also like very interesting is like these public protests do not reproduce the Sud Supply campaign kiss in the same way or in the same degree of intensity, nor they are exclusively performed by LGBTQ people. These circumstances also like is allowing us to speculate how these reenactments contribute to promoting normalized representations of actually public intimacy and how these circulate the representing back into the media sphere. However, despite this concrete example, which could be like very much kind of like this is this tiny thing, if you pull the thread and start to look at it a bit around, and that's part of the work we have been doing, we see that the effects of media architecture and other examples of like hybrid space in which urban public space, databases, policy making decisions are combining together happens in different parts of the Netherlands. This is an example of like Stripe S, which is in Eindhoven, which is actually an area that has been redeveloped at the moment. And we were like very much interested into not looking at something that has happened, but something that is how it is happening. we can see that actually in this particular moment in which consumer spaces are privileging almost like a constituted materiality with the online and the offline, heterosexual gender and sexual representations are also increasingly privileged in the Netherlands. And in this way, the heterosexualization of public space is normalized and naturalized as characteristic. Equally than with the bus stops in this specific place, what we are seeing is in a stairs that was also specifically designed for this space, also like trying to create almost like an iconic piece that could function as a recognizable item within the neighborhood. So we see that in here happens very much like a similar effect in which actually there is a repeated stylization of the body, and in relationship to the architecture and the gaze of the camera, bodies are choreographed. The repetition of images, because this all is coming from a big database that we were like downloading from social media of like something like around almost like 1,000 images that we were like processing. We see that this repetition of images and the interactions online and offline actually has the capacity to give spaces, the capacity to model our lives. And this is particularly crucial in these areas in development. Also considering like the relationship with social media and the promotion and normalizing effects that can exist of behaviors in social media, such as likes, reacts, upvotes, or commenting that actually algorithmically leads to privileging certain stories about others and pushing it to the top of the feed in an effort to prioritize almost like the circulation of specific narratives. So one of the things that we want to put forward, and I would like to put forward in here, is like some points of discussion of all of this intermingle. We can tackle it from different angles. But one of the things that I would like also like to discuss a lot with you all today is also like looking at how one like this media architecture complex is bound to this entanglement of data, software, technologies, protocols, commercial interests, political discourses that continue requiring an urgent analysis and a deconstruction, I think specifically from a design perspective, and also to understand how there might be like a lack of agency with which to directly engage, object, and transform these systems, especially from the level of the cities and from the smaller one. Because also like up until now, a lot of like design approaches for understanding and holding the systems accountable rest almost on ideas of transparency. And although these methodologies help awareness on the operations, do not necessarily help to act on that knowledge. It is for this reason that actually is almost like a call into like looking at design practices that could actively engage into accountability process, but a thing like this will happen. And also an urgency for designers, not only to question the conditions under which our disciplines are contributing to these normative processes, but also to provide accessible tools and spaces for their participation and contestation. Yay, that was that. I hope it was clear.
It was clear. It was brilliant. It was fast paced, full throttle.
As fun as the speed, yeah.
No, thank you for that. That was really insightful. And yes, you've given us a lot of material to work with. Before we start our talk, I'm going to swiftly go on to introduce Lucas and pass the floor on to them. Lucas Larochel, welcome. Lucas is a designer and a researcher based in Montreal, Canada. Graduate of Concordia and the Utrecht University of Applied Sciences here in the Netherlands. Their practice is centered on queer and trans digital cultures, community-based learning, and co-creative media. Their essay, Queering the Map on Designing Digital Queer Space, was also recently published in the 2020 Routledge publication, Queer Sites in Global Contexts, Technology, Spaces, and Otherness, of which there are digital copies available to download online. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Roberto, for your presentation. I'm so excited to get to the part where we get to talk to each other. So I'm going to talk today about two projects and thinking about the from and the to and the space in between these projects as my offering before we lean into the conversation. So while I'm joining you today in cyberspace, my physical body is located in Tiohtià:ke Munyang, or Montreal, which is on the unceded lands and waters of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. It's a place that has historically been an important meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Abenaki, and Anishinaabe or Algonquin peoples, amongst others. Today, it's home to diverse communities of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and I stand in solidarity as a settler on stolen land with ongoing movements for Indigenous sovereignty across Turtle Island and beyond. So in the fall of 2017, I launched a project called Queering the Map, which is a community-generated countermapping platform for digitally archiving LGBTQ2IA+ experiences in relation to physical space. It takes the form of an annotatable map, and the platform provides an interface with which to collaboratively archive the cartographies of queer and trans life, from the banal to the ecstatic, the sustaining to the violent, in order to preserve and circulate queer and trans histories and unfolding realities. So through mapping LGBTQ2IA+ experiences and their intersectional permutations, the project works to generate affinity across difference and beyond borders. And so this platform that began as a humble site of my own recollections and those of my immediate community in Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, or Montreal has, over the past 3.5 years, quite rapidly grown into an expansive archive of feelings, to think with Anne Chvetkevich, that stretches across the globe, now with over 134 submissions in 24 different languages. LGBTQ2IA+ communities, and particularly communities of color, are both historically and contemporaneously subject to heightened surveillance. As such, Queering the Map was necessarily built from a logic of data opacity. In contrast to the schemes of data extraction and profiling that typify dominant platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc., data opacity as a strategy prioritizes anonymity and privacy through collecting as little data as possible. So rather than gathering sensitive data and working to encrypt it, such data is not collected at all. It's not possible to create a discrete user profile on Queering the Map, and therefore submissions are made anonymously. The site does not collect any user data such as names, phone numbers, emails, etc., in association with the text submissions, and in turn mitigates the harm that can be done with the misuse of this data. So the decision to build the infrastructure of the platform in this way is as much about safety and privacy as it is about following a queer logic of incommensurability. The process of moderating the thousands of submissions that populate the platform, which is a labor that I gratefully undertake with some of my friends, but it's a labor that I didn't know the extent of which would become such a structuring force in my life, is a bewildering experience of data overload. So within the folder of my mind that houses all of the things Queering the Map, there exists a very large corrupted .zip file of the platform's database. So calls to make sense or to summarize its contents into legible conclusions is always a process of failure to distill the incommensurability of transnational LGBTQ2IA+ life. This is because so much of the writing on Queering the Map is opaque. It offers us only a partial view. So to draw a clean set of conclusions would be to foreclose the complexity that each story holds as an individual narrative fragment, a piece of theory in its own right. We don't know the full context of the stories people share. We're given only traces, glimmers, possibilities of the experiences that they are transcribing. And so oftentimes I have been asked over the course of stewarding this platform, what do we learn from Queering the Map? What are the takeaways about LGBTQ2IA+ life that the platform reveals? And my answer to that is, I imagine, quite frustrating to the people that pose those questions, which is ultimately that there are 130,000 plus submissions in the database, 130,000 plus different ways that this question can be answered. As submissions to querying the map grow, so too does its perceived value as a data set by virtue of its volume. It is a data set of queer life, yes, but its structural opacity also renders it a queered data set. There is an inherent tension, or perhaps even an impossibility, to the very idea of queer data. Data masquerades as fixed and objective, whereas queer signifies fluidity, multiplicity. A queer approach to data would be committed to undoing the very foundations of big data's claims to objectivity in an effort to privilege the anecdotal, the situated, the embodied, and multiplicitous ways of knowing and feeling the world. So how might we queer the supposed objectivity of data by reveling in its incoherencies and in turn imagine new worlds through this oblique lens? Rather, and this leads me to Qtbot, which is a project that I started in 2019, my question is, rather than using artificial intelligence to increase the transparency of a given data set, how might we appropriate AI to meet queer ends in search of opacity? So Qtbot emerges at precisely this point, a means of resisting the call to make sense, to be legible, by turning towards the ecstasies of opacity. So Qtbot is an AI trained on the textual and visual data of querying the map that generates speculative queer and trans futures and the environments in which they occur. Qtbot's digital intersubjectivity is constructed from an implementation of the OpenAI GPT-2 text generation model, trained on over 82,000 text entries from the platform, and a style GAN implemented by my friend and collaborator, machine learning engineer Maddie Tesfeldet, that was trained on scraped Google Street View imagery from the tagged coordinates on the platform. The narratives and landscapes of speculative LGBTQ2A+ life generated by Qtbot straddle the line between the plausible and the fantastic, reveling in the potential of failure, chaos, and incommensurability in the queer use of machine learning technologies. So in collaboration with the voices of their human community, Qtbot fabulates on the absences of the archive, orienting us away from what is or has been and towards what could be. So the anonymous participative internet user is often characterized as the troll, the kind of user who, in resisting the call for transparency and legibility, is stripped of the ability to appear legitimate. On Querying the Map, precisely because submissions to the project are made anonymously and bear no corroborating evidence other than the subjective recounting of the ephemeral, and to quote Jose Esteban Munoz, traces, glimmers, and residues of an event. There's a deliberate refusal to play into systems of archival truth that always already cast LGBTQ2A+ life as invalid or up for debate. The inability to trace a submission back to the user stymies the ability to validate the realness of any story posted. No way to provide proper evidence to the legitimacy of an event. So Qtbot puts into overdrive these questions of authenticity in the archive, or what it means to speculate in, with, and beyond the official contents of an archive. One of the thinkers who's central to me in working through this project, that inspires me in her way of working through these kinds of questions, is Sadia Hartman, who coined the concept of critical fabulation as a way of filling in the blanks of an archive. In her essay, Venus in Two Acts, she deploys the term to work through the absences in the archive of the experiences of Black women in the transatlantic slave trade. Critical fabulation is a way for her to fill in the blanks, to build bridges between pieces of disparate information that for reasons of violence and erasure do not exist in an official capacity. Hartman's context and mine are very different, but I see Qtbot in a similar way, an agent for fabulating in the archive, a way of refusing to rely on only what is officially documented as a way of making a history. Addressing the lack of queer and trans experiences in official archives and popular media in the built environment as well, Qtbot becomes a collaborator with whom to dream about, with, and through our pasts. not dreaming past and future as a linear temporality, but dreaming of other worlds that are happening in parallel to the world in which we are currently living. Fabulation in the archive is a form of refusal that makes new futures possible. It undoes the sacrosanct project of truth-telling that both the map and the archive are set up to produce, thus queering the archive in its masquerade as a bearer of objectivity. QTbot's hive mind is an organism for generating glimmers of futures that emerge at the point in which, and to think again with Jose Esteban Munoz, quote, singularities flow into the common. Like queer space itself, often been theorized in relation to the ephemeral, the spaces that QTbot illuminates are temporally promiscuous, a collective deep dream of thousands of locations haunted by the residues of queer and trans affect. The experiences of viewing the machinic narratives and environments of LGBTQ2A+ life that QTbot propagates is one of disorientation. Time, space, subjectivity collapse, producing multiplicitous visions of the many worlds contained within the dataset. Collapse here critically does not extinguish difference. The erratic tenor of the texts and the cacophony of the images gestures towards a chorus of voices singing in discordant unison. Like the flashing strobes of light piercing the darkness of an underground rave that I cannot wait to experience again soon, QTbot offers us a momentary glimpse into the ecstasies of being together in difference. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. I am in a meeting. Bye. Sorry, Arkham has been generous enough to offer me this space. If you're in Amsterdam, please come and have a look at their show. It's fantastic. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Lucas. That was super poetic and super beautiful. Some of the critical fabulation. I'd love to kind of, maybe before I give you both the floor to kind of discuss some things, I'd love for you to maybe expand upon this idea of the palimpsest that it offers, this idea of past, present, and future, because I definitely see the overlap kind of occurring within the algorithms that Roberto was suggesting were kind of spatialized with the CAFAS kind of program. So if maybe you could start off with that, and then Roberto could jump in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the place that I would start with that in terms of my own thinking through QTbot as a project, when I started it at first, I was really thinking about what if queering the map operates very much in the, or predominantly, though not entirely, in the past and the present to a certain extent, what would an archive that looks towards the future, what kind of form would that take? And that's one of the things that I'm thinking about as I extend the research of QTbot to build an interactive digital platform and an archive that will host these sort of fantastical stories. And I was really stuck in this sort of like the past and the present as the future as these three different temporalities, which when I recognized that impulse in myself, it felt very strange because that's not actually how I thought. Queering the map as a project emerges very much from thinking about all of these stories, all of the stories of a place existing at the same time. And so then my thinking with QTbot was that it actually wasn't necessarily about a future, but rather about these sorts of parallel temporalities, things that were happening, worlds that were happening simultaneously. And there was something about that shift in how I was thinking about temporality in relationship to QTbot as a project that felt like it was doing the affective or like liberatory work that I needed it to do, that was enabling me to think about the future as something that is in the present. And that's something that Jose Esteban Munoz teaches us. Rather than something that is, and maybe a little bit different than his idea of, you know, queer utopianism being on the horizon, it's the horizon that never comes. I think I need to, as a different sort of survival strategy, as a different relationship to hope than perhaps he would formulate, I need a proximity. I need to sort of like split or to a certain extent dissociate from the world at present in order to be able to survive in it. And Qtbot, yeah, my thinking with Qtbot and my making with Qtbot enables me to feel other worlds that are happening simultaneously.
Get that, Roberto?
Yeah, I guess for me, like the entry point that I was having, like starting to look at all of these geographical informational systems, it was like a lot of like trying to understand what is spatial relationship between technology and sexuality, and also the extent to which actually is like not only technology, but also like even thinking of a philosophy of technology will be able to account for queer forms of difference, and also like how actually sexual subjects could be said to be included or excluded on this account, and how actually such a thing could be not only about like questions about like who speaks for technology, but also like who is spoken for by technology. And that was like the entry point of looking at the GABAs and how all of this was articulated, especially because many of these geographic information systems are assuming very particular understandings of time and space that assumes like unique central point of view that articulates the space in a very Cartesian way of looking. And then the idea was like actually what it could be the entry point that actually could be breaking this. And then in my particular case, which is a lot of like working about directly with the body, it was like much more coming, and I think there is a bit of a crossover in there, into like trying to understand these platforms. What could it happen when you take this as a situated knowledge and an embodied experience, especially as an alternative, as a narrative of scientific progress, also because the general discourse is always towards bigger databases, into more perfect databases, into more complex, even like actually the way that are articulated into trying to have more representation in how it is done. But at the end of the day, actually the complexity of lived experience will be really never able to be put in there, precisely by this temporality. But also at a certain point, it was like the idea of also when we talk about time, it was also like the assumption in this relationship that actually is like databases and technology, sometimes they seem to have a bit of an understanding about them that is also fixed in time, but also the body seems to be having a fixed in time. And there's like a whole discussion into like who is precluding or who is the one that is measuring against which, when at the end of the day, both of them are also quite of a fictionality. And in there is a whole potential actually for the affective elements of the body to be able to disrupt this and to generate, yeah, opacity and unreadability. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this idea of opacity is definitely something that's quite interesting, because you both explore this idea of what is visible, what is opaque. You explore Lucas through anonymity. You actually displace any kind of user identification from this experience that is just sharing and querying the map and developing this new realm. And Roberto, you explored from an issue of ideology. It's very much a kind of visual representation of that ideology, of that gendering, that queering that's kind of happening in physical space in the city. Was that a cul-de-sac? Did I hit a? I feel like it's very interesting how both of you tend to, especially within your written work, tend to write about where you situate yourself within that. And I think that's what I would like to kind of not necessarily give you a question or question you with, but prompt you on this idea of you, Lucas, finding your place by being out of place. And then Roberto really exploring being out of place while simultaneously being put into place through this idea of where the actual advertisement is located, how it relates to the psychogeography of the city and its inhabitants. Lucas, do you think, or Roberto?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, please go ahead.
No, please do.
Ahead.
Jump in, everyone.
It's almost I can also answer the question, but I think that's what one of the things that I was responding so much in your work, Roberto, too, is this relationship to physical space that Ali, when you mentioned that, like the end of my the Queering the Map essay that was published, finding my place by being out of place kind of thing, as something that happened as I translated my work from being, when I started studying design, I was really interested in physical computation. I was more interested in materiality than perhaps I am now, because Queering the Map sort of became, you know, the structuring force of my life for the past couple of years. And increasingly, and I guess I'm trying to think about like how my physical body has been transformed by my relationship to this platform, and specifically the database. And there's something that what I was really responding to in your work, Roberta, was the physical nature, like what it means to work with these digital tools that you're using and then relocate them in space, which is something that I'm sort of, I just had a couple of billboards installed in Linz with 2 QTbot posters on. It was a really exciting experience. I mean, I sadly wasn't able to go and see them physically, which made me really sad, because that is something that I'm really interested in, is about like resituating myself in relationship to physical space as I'm working with all of these digital tools. Yeah, maybe I can pass it over to you, and maybe also pose it as a question of what that translation is like for you.
Yeah, I guess that maybe the idea of like bringing physicality and bringing the body, it was like a very kind of like ground to earth approach into understanding that all of these complex interrelated processes have very clear and real effects on the specific bodies. Actually, it's like within the fictionality of it all, at the end of the day, there is also like very tangible elements of this. And then it's also understanding that this idea of opacity operates in a really different levels. And what opacity, at least for me, I started to understand is actually, to unpack this concept, I needed to start unpacking it through different lenses, not only through political discourse or not only opacity in the ways that actually databases are created, but also what does it mean opacity in actual public space. And then in there, a notion that was like, you were also kind of mentioning, and that was like taking it a bit forward, is this ideas of orientation and disorientation. Because although all of these systems, especially these geomarketing software, are very much reliant on codification of the body and actually economy of attention. Where are you looking? How are you moving? How long do you stay? What is happening in there? Still, there is a tiny element that exists in there that is very much embodied and material, which is actually having the capacity to create rupture, that in a way also like this campaign of Supai was putting forward, which is the idea of the affective, which I also like really like a lot, that you were like putting it forward, like the affective because cuts across, not only in public space, but even like the affective labor that it takes to be working with these databases, even like from the beginning of almost communicational theory, how these theories has been formed about communication and how they have been disregarded, even women, female figures, even with the metaphors of the cables and the labor that was going to there, and the disruption in this affective to be really able to create a noise in the system. And then within this affective, I guess that maybe like this campaign, what was important for me to think is also like on the power of the erotic, that it still has as a way of creating a certain opacity and a different way of organizing and orienting yourself in public space. Because at the end of the day, there is a lot of like queer practices that relate to affect into the erotic, especially using the erotic almost like very much into like, other lore approach, which is about the material affective forms of power that emerge from creating vulnerable connections with other across difference. And then in there, I think there is a source of power and a source of information that is uncodifiable, and that also leads to certain opacity. That makes sense. I'm threading as I talk.
Totally. I wonder, the images of the campaign where the people's faces and skin like outside of the clothing was removed. I feel like there was an exciting, I mean, I know that I guess this is sort of drawing like a through line, but in terms of that relationship to opacity, like what is made visible, also in relationship to like attention economies, I understand that those existed in public space, but I was really thinking about like, what does it mean to work with obscuring the body to a certain extent in digital environments, I guess also in physical environments as well. What the difference of that campaign, or what the difference in that the experience of people viewing those works in public space is like when you know, the face being the thing, at least in like an algorithmic context, that is like, that is what we respond to, that's what, you know, gets the most, you know, you post, like if you're going to post some text, you post a picture of your face first so that people actually engage with the content. You post a thirst, or like even like structures of activism that I've seen happen, where like hot people on Instagram will post like trying to do like, you know, activism, will like post a thirst trap and then post, you know, the information that they want to disseminate. And I wondered if this is sort of like a way of responding to those images, which I felt like were really powerful. And maybe, yeah, if I could ask you to talk more about those.
Yeah, I guess like the decision of removing any skin out of the images was a way of like almost like emphasizing a middle layer between code and the body as a way of like codified body. That was a bit like the idea of like, then suddenly at the end of the day, it's not that much about identity, but it's like about a specific body aesthetizations and stylizations that actually become codified, produced and reproduced in a very mechanical way. And that was like that mechanization of the body. That was like the way of like removing that element of like humanness. And then you start to see less it as a very specific individual as a person, but much more of like specific, if you want to say, blueprints or archetypes that exist and we relate to. That was a bit like the idea with that specific element. But I also like find it interesting because in your work, actually you refer to the body, but you remove the body. However, you bring space. So I was wondering what was your decision into like, because in the map, there's also quite often a specific choice with the boat of removing any body in there. So I will ask you, what is your resistance of decision of,
my resistance to imaging the body? I think, well, one of the other impulses in creating Queering the Map was trying to resist the sort of commodification of the image of the body in social media platforms, and the way that the individual body, like a body, becomes the stand-in for an individual, which is not necessarily the way that I understand my own body. As like my body is something that's always being produced in relation. And there's something about the opacity of text as a starting point that references the body. The body is very present, I would say, in the stories I'm querying up. So it's a project about describing embodiment in relationship to physical space, without relying on the way in which we've learned, I guess, in my thinking, like through social media environments, to consume the body and to understand the body as an individual. That there's something about seeing all these stories in relationship to each other that disrupts or like pierces through an individual body and starts to sew it to a collective body, which is an idea that I'm really invested in thinking through, and I would say almost a pathological way. And I need to actually, like, you know, orient myself towards my body. It's also like, I don't like putting pictures of myself on the internet. It makes me very uncomfortable. It makes me very dysphoric in many ways. And there's something about text that it's like, I think it's the form of art that moves me the most, because it allows me to think outside the limits of my own physicality.
That's absolutely beautiful, Lucas. I'm glad you are kind of going in this direction, because I was hoping that we would start talking about how we situate ourselves within that. Thank you for sharing that. That's quite personal. I love, Roberto, how you describe this kind of codification of the body. I particularly found them quite moving and quite powerful images as well, mostly for the use of the transparency grid instead of using a content-aware cutout. There's no attempt to kind of create this kind of invisible person where clothes are levitating and you just fill out the staircase in the background. It's very much a specific, and again, I'm going to use your term, codification. Why do you, if I was going to kind of pose this idea, I'm going to pronounce this very badly, inconsumability. If you were going to apply that same logic, Lucas, you referred to this idea of translating your work within the academic realm. You do that both in your piece and you kind of implied that here. How do you feel, Roberto, that you could impact potentially the creators of these algorithms and these of CAFAs? How do you think you can, beyond hijacking the physical space, use those kind of terminologies? Like what can be deployed within the city? And what agency do you think the city's inhabitant, or you yourself as a designer could have?
Yeah, I think I want to bring maybe like this idea of like coming back of I'm becoming more and more worried about the process of inclusion and inclusivity in many of these actions they are taking into trying to ensure that multiplicities of experiences and differences across different axes of modes of existence are going to be, because in a way there is a bit of like already like a certain politics of like this idea of already like actually consumering those identities. So that I take it in many ways. Like one of them, like specifically in my particular case, there is a resistance to position myself that actually I'm trying to implement a work around. Like, yes, I do work within the context of design, but I do not always operate in the context of design as a designer, but I might present myself through the social work that I am doing. In social work or policymaking processes, I present myself as the designer. And there's like all this array of multiplicities of like combining all of the positions in which I am that actually allow me to constantly put myself as the unreadable kind of like a wild ballet that in a way has the capacity to be able to pose the questions that nobody else is able to do on those specific spaces, or at least attempt to do so, simply because I don't I try to resist this capacity to unify or bring all of these identities together. There's an element in there. Also within, so I like to keep it as split, as kaleidoscopic as possible. Also, there's the idea of like bringing my own lived experience and how do I create abstractions and the methods by which I'm really able to tell these stories and in which ways. That I think there is always like methods of working with that, which is like visually in the stories, in an academic article, in an activist, in a gesture, in a performance, that actually all of them create different vocabularies and I don't need to completely tie myself with that. And there is an element of like working on processes of like building up within these processes of contestation. And this has to do, maybe coming back, circulating to the first idea, that I am not that much interested only in possibilities of like by default designing this in a more forward way, but coming to the idea that actually there's not a possibility of creating a perfect system that is going to be representing all of the lived experience of everybody, but there is a possibility of creating systems that in build has the capacity to be contested and to be made accountable. And that's one of the elements that I'm much more interested, operating through the back. Like how do we design elements, architectures, or spaces that in themselves include already like the possibility to be criticized, to be made accountable, and to be made. And that's one of the elements that I find interesting, more like the other entry point.
Wow.
Lucas, what do you think about this idea of accountability?
I'm going to sit with that idea of entering through the back. I mean, in some ways for its inherent queerness, but taking it there because I'm 12 years old. But what a brilliant, that gave me chills, this idea, like what does it mean to build a system with a back door kind of thing that that invites other people in. And I don't know if I have anything to say because it's like that just it rocked my my world as a way of thinking about, because I share, Roberto, what you said, that, you know, the inclusion and diversity as a strategy of only sort of like consuming the bodies marked as diverse, and expanding from there. And this idea, but then this idea of like, what would a system built for, with like the desire, because accountability, because registering complaint in an institutional context, in a structural context is you know, presently such a disaster. Thinking about restructuring from, if the back door is like where you build from first, rather than the back door, or like the other way, or opening new doors or new seats at the table kind of thing, is the way that we might say that inclusion and diversity strategies work presently. So I have nothing to say other than like, wow.com/ can't wait to keep thinking with that idea.
Wonderful. I think we're gonna start running out of time very soon, so I'm gonna move over to some questions. There was a recent question. Thank you for the people who asked those questions. There were a few questions about accountability, and specifically in relationship to creating the map. And this I think you share on your website, but maybe you could give an indication to some of our audience members if you face any abusive content and how you approach the moderation process.
Yes, the moderation process exists as a response to the map being flooded by pro-Trump trolls in 2018. And so it is set up to mitigate that kind of content from reaching the front of the map, which is sort of an easy way of thinking about the moderation. Like if someone posting like fucking faggots, or, you know, like whatever, something that's very obviously an attack on the map is one stream of the moderation. But arguably the most important, and where I think the work, or the trickiness of moderation comes, is what happens when someone who is writing a story about, let's say, queer experience, and that experience is codified or explicitly racist or explicitly transphobic. And that's, I mean, it's, when I say it's challenging, it's actually not that challenging, and the protocol is that that's not what the space is for. There's like a limit to, you know, like liberal, like freedom of expression is not really what I'm interested in on queering the map. I'm interested in, I mean, creating a complex space, but also not creating a space where people are being triggered or attacked, and not creating a space for racism, homophobia, transphobia to proliferate itself. Which, I mean, could be interpreted as a censorship of people articulating themselves, but I'm not really interested as the person responsible for this platform to make that space. And I mean, I think the other thing too, which is a side question, but it's interesting, also thinking of, I'm thinking about almost like accountability in reverse to a certain extent in terms of the moderation protocol, which has been challenging to the scale of the amount of posts. I think there's currently like 74,000 submissions in the moderation queue. And the predominant, like the emails that I most often receive to the Queering the Map email account is like, where is my story? Why has it not been posted? Which I think is accompanied by this sense of like a feeling of potentially being censored, because I think it's better now than it was at the beginning, but I think that there is the expectation that these digital platforms that enable us to share our stories or express ourselves are, that there's no human labor behind that, which is, you know, of course not, it's not the case on Facebook, it's not the case on Instagram, it's not, but this sort of like obfuscation of the body of myself and my friends that help me moderate, creates a tricky sort of relationship, because it creates an immense amount of labor. And my accountability to the audience of Queering the Map is that I've made it my work for the past number of years to develop the platform, sustain the platform, moderate the stories as quickly as I can. But there are limits to, how many things I can click through in a day, both in terms of like the manual labor, but also the affective labor that is required of reading stories that are, sometimes cute and wonderful, and other times like I need to go cry in the corner for 30 minutes because it's like so deeply disturbed. I don't know if that answers the question. I gave 3.
No, it was very, very thorough. We're unfortunately running out of time, but we can extend it for a few more minutes. We just have one more question to get through, which is about projects like Queering the Map and QTBot and critical fabulation. Even though the question is directed at you, Lucas, I'm actually going to pose it to Roberto.
I love that.
Yeah. Do they still aim at accessing official channels or discourses? Do these machines still try to work within what's existing? Do they transcend binary boundaries, mainstream versus side stream? Or is it meant to cancel out the mainstream currents of thoughts anyway, at any point? And I feel like that really relates to both your work and how you situate it and how Lucas does. So if you could just very briefly kind of go through that. I can't tell if you're frozen or not. Oh no, you're just looking up. I mean, if you think about what it is that you are trying to explore and unravel within these systems, we're looking at these interrelated kind of media technologies. You're looking at databases. You're looking at spatial kind of coordinate-based city maps. Are we trying to infiltrate these? Are we trying to somehow establish them in different ways individually, or is it just a different way of perceiving all of them together? Maybe some food for thought.
Yeah. I also feel a bit difficult kind of like answering, since it's quite of like a directed question towards that, and I don't have like fully knowledge.
Sure.
But I think one of the things that I like about the project that you're putting forward with the boat is this way of understanding almost like a very spatial way of normativity, or what is not normativity, and the resistance of normativity that actually challenges quite a lot this spatial imaginarian of the norm as a device that the norm as a device that divides the world into specific centers and peripheries. And then the cartography, the way you're using it, bringing it together and working around, actually is having the possibility to create and still connected space, which is also a different kind of archive. It's not detached from the world. It's like a different kind of connection with a different set of roles, from which actually there's an affective quality and a possibility for developing through these fabulations new worlds and new realities, but also has the capacity also like to challenge normativity through a different lens, which is almost like in a structure of proliferation, almost like trying to understand if actually it's like about the applications, twistings, amplifying, and then that's that counter element in there. I think that's one of the exciting things that can pose like a different logic to these other big databases, and also what is the role of the smaller archives and the relationship in that friction. Yeah, if that makes sense. But I'm totally improvising because I don't know much about the bot. Sorry.
Totally. That was, I mean, what a beautiful, that was beautiful. And I think especially that idea of proliferation or more than, rather than sort of like thinking how, again, returning to that idea of like inclusion and diversity, it's like, okay, where do we put the people who were not meant to fit within these structures,
Mhm.
where these sorts of way of working is like, yeah, you flood, you make your own space, you flood, you proliferate as a way, and not necessarily, I think the question is sort of like positioning it within a binary sort of structure. And I think it's sort of like, it's always a within and against. We're creating our own kinds of spaces outside of those systems. And yes, we need to figure out ways of interfacing within them. But yes, maybe this strategy of proliferation is one direction.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you both for joining us. And thank you everyone for your questions. Please make sure to join us next Tuesday, June 22nd, but at 3 p.m. instead of at 6, where Jorn Konijn will be expanding upon today's thematic of the built environment, but with a lens towards exploring cultural, ethnic, and racial diversity, specifically in De Bijlmer. Have a great evening. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care.